Now you have three presentations which have already been read. Professor Parag Tripathi has made a very powerful presentation to open to questions. Then Shobhit Malik has presented the paper of Shobhit Malik's paper has been presented by Dinesh Singh, and he has made a point concerning saying that the socio-economic rights jurisprudence seems to be moving in the right direction, though slowly. The third paper is regarding the Chinese system of rule of judicial process, and how through interpretation the courts are trying to balance between the sort of conservative and radical lines, and I think both they are on fire from both sides. You are too conservative, you are too radical, and for different reasons. Now these presentations are open to your questions and comments. Anyone would like to start? Yes?
This question is for Professor Tripathi. Professor Tripathi, you talked about anti-majoritarian functions of the high judiciary, and you also referred to this non-formation case. So my question is, do you think the judiciary should hold some kind of referendum before making a decision on the public issues, or it should confine itself to the constitutional parameters provided by Indian Constitution?
See, the function of judiciary is to be insulated from the public opinion of the day and to deal with the issues which are properly brought before it in accordance with law and the Constitution. If that is the function we accept and attribute to judiciary, then referendum may be out. But what you say is interesting, because that is what I said, Mark Tushnet and others have said, that the courts even in the US are weakly counter-majoritarian. Why? Because it's something they always have at the back of their mind. So as I said, they can move a little ahead of public opinion, but never far too ahead. So the answer is no, I don't think you can bring in referendum, because the whole concept of rule of law is that there are certain inviolable principles, and whether the action executive or legislative violates them. If it violates them, then the finger has to go up whether people like it or not. But having said that the answer is no, how it will be reacted upon by their foundation of legitimacy, that is people's acceptance of the court as an institution, is always in their mind. I hope that answers it.
Yes.
A couple of observations again to the party's presentation, which I very much enjoyed. If I understood correctly, you're saying that perhaps the majority was supportive of decriminalizing homosexuality. I do not have empirical evidence, but my feeling is that majority of people who were critical of the Supreme Court judgment, they were coming from cities and towns. If hypothetically a referendum took place in India on this question, my feeling is that a majority would be consistent with the Supreme Court, that we do not need to decriminalize homosexuality at this point of that's my feeling. So perhaps I slightly disagree with the assumption that you are making. But my more substantive points are this, two observations, and perhaps you may comment on that. The first is the selectivity in the hands-off approach shown by the Indian Supreme Court. So, in principle, I'm fine with judiciary showing deference to the executive on certain policy matters. But the real difficulty is that when in certain cases the judiciary will exercise the hands-off approach, but in other matters it will not. So it will start legislating about whether it's D.K. Basu, Vishakha, or endless number of cases, ragging, this and that. But when it comes to certain matters, it will show hands-off approach. This selectivity, what is the basis? So as a scholar, it is very difficult to find a coherent approach within the Indian Supreme Court that, okay, these are the matters of policy in which we will show hands of approach, and these are the matters in which we will intervene. Perhaps one proposition could be that if there is a vacuum, meaning whereby Parliament or the executive branch has not acted, the courts perhaps are not showing hands of approach. But if the Parliament or the executive has acted, let us say section 377, then they are more showing the hands of approach. That is just my part of the explanation, but you may have something else to add. The second point, I don't think you did actually say that, but if I extend your argument a little bit further, and I would like to get your reflection on this, do you believe that the activist judicial interventions of the Indian Supreme Court over the last 20-30 years, they have adversely affected the evolution of strong democratic governance in India? Because people are running towards judiciary every time they see a problem instead of looking towards the politicians and parliament and executive. So my feeling is that judiciary has undermined inadvertently the evolution of democratic governance by trying to be too activist on many occasions. Thank you.
I will ask a question too. I think very similar to you were saying anti-majoritarianism of the higher judiciary, and I will give you, and I would like your responses on that. Two decisions recently in the last 2 months of two high courts, higher judiciary decisions. One of Rajasthan High Court saying that Santhara is violation of section 309 of the Penal Code. Santhara, that is public dying, which is a Jain tradition. And another decision of Jammu High Court saying that section 292A and 292B of 298A, 298B of the Ranbir Penal Code makes beef eating and beef sale an offence. Therefore, we want that this law should be enforced. The High Court decides that this provisions of Penal Code, Ranbir Penal Code, both of them are talking of Penal Code provisions being applied. Now, will you call the first, the Rajasthan High Court decision pro-majoritarian or anti-majoritarian? Will you call the Jammu and High Court decision pro-majoritarian or anti-majoritarian? Now, both cases, I think Santhara is not a practice which non-Jainis, and Rajasthan has, Jainis are just a minority there. Therefore, though the Supreme Court has pushed the debate to a future date because it was an uncomfortable debate. Now, in Jammu and Kashmir, again, Hindus are in minority, all the petitioners are Hindus, the two judges are Hindus, so they belong to majority community. Now, there you want to enforce. Now, will you call the Jammu and Kashmir High Court decision anti-majoritarian, or will you call the Rajasthan anti-majoritarian? And how do you make that categorization? That is a big question, because something which may be in the Rajasthan decision may not be anti-majoritarian, it may be pro-majoritarian, and say similarly the Jammu decision may be. And how do you understand this framework of anti-majoritarianism? This might apply in Nas Foundation, all right. And there also, I agree with Professor Surya where he said that your assumption that majority was opposed to the, the section in question, majority may not be opposed. If you took rural majority, if you took majority all over the country, and Supreme Court may have been right. So how do you? Yes, please do.
Thank you, Professor Surya, and thank you, my chair, for very incisive comments. May I begin with the 3 points Professor made, and then I'll come to Rajasthan and Jammu. I had actually said that the reaction as we get from the literati and the chatterati and the people who normally react give an impression that the view of the majority was in favor of the Delhi High Court judgment. So I agree with you that eventually which way it goes one doesn't know. May I just tell you one thing though, which is very interesting, that in India, that is, I went through it when I was dealing with these very judgments at the Jindal Global Law School. We have historic and mythological recognition at the level of gods of homosexuality. Coming out from mythology, the great Babur was madly in love with a gentleman boy called Baburi. So much so that Babur lost it completely when Baburi went missing. So homosexuality of course has history in India. We didn't go into that. Yes, I agree with you that we don't know what eventually the decision would be. In our parliament and state legislature also, it is not always the village man whose views get articulated and accepted. So I think if you look at, if I may say so, the voluble majority, the vocal majority, it would look like that it was in support of the judgment of the Delhi High Court. Which way the actual majority goes, I agree with you, is far from certain. Coming to the second point, which is a very interesting point which the professor makes, about selectivity of the Supreme Court. Now that arises out of one more thing which is really outside the paradigm of the counter-majoritarian function. That is, Indian Supreme Court, unlike the US, doesn't sit en bloc. So we as arguing counsel know that there are today 14 courts, so there are actually 14 Supreme Courts. And I don't say it in a lighter way, I say it in all seriousness. Because when you're arguing a matter, the first thing any good senior counsel would ask, or arguing counsel would ask, before whom is it listed? Because with that comes a whole, if I may say so, a whole backlog and a suitcase of ideas, ideologies, approaches. So the same judgment which may be completely disagreed to, say, before Justice MP Singh, would be completely held to the contrary before Justice Ranveer Singh, and so on and so forth. So you will look at the court and then argue. So part of the reason of this selectivity is the court. One bench will say, of course we're going to go into this. What are you saying? First answer is on this. The other bench will say no. So that is one part of it. Secondly, the decision to pick up or not to pick up is again a bench-specific decision. It is also an institutional decision. So all judges would, I guess, at some level say, we won't transcend this barrier because this is getting into a political questions thicket, we would like to get there. But within that broad no-go line or no-go zone, there will be variations depending on which is the bench which is hearing the matters. The third is, I think, the most important point you made, that has activism in some sense stunted the evolution of the political process? The article of Professor Tripathi Senior, which I pointed out, read that into the ADM Jabalpur decision and its effect. I think the answer is yes and no. I know that's not a great answer to give, but many times that's the only correct answer to give. Yes and no, why? Because yes, when the Supreme Court comes and interferes and intervenes, that whole political process gets short-circuited. It's like if you have a son and you have a rich father, and he overspends, then you pay his credit card bills. The learning which he will have otherwise of 10 days without any money is short circuited. So it doesn't help him in the long run. No, because there are certain things which have perhaps to be kick-started by an institution other than a purely political institution like the legislature or the parliament, because those institutions run by the political principles. They run by what they consider politically doable and not doable. So they may know that A is the right way, but they would not like to go there. The classic case would be that all MPs or MLAs should disclose their wealth and their particular details. They know that's the right thing, but they won't do it because it doesn't make sense for them politically. So therefore I say yes and no. But surely each of these three things deserve, particularly the last two, deserve a much greater debate than I can possibly do in a short time. I think these are very important questions which you flagged. Then our chair has flagged two very interesting questions. One is the Santhara judgment. Now, is it counter-majoritarian or is it not counter-majoritarian? Maybe the answer, and likewise the Ranveer Penal Court, the name of which bears an uncanny similarity to our distinguished Vice Chancellor who is here, but I don't think that's a trademark issue. Now, coming to the anti-majoritarian aspect, you see, when I was dealing with constitutionalism, I said there are two elements of the counter-majoritarian principle, three actually: representation, reinforcement, knock it off, originalism, and living constitutionalism. Likewise, when you are talking of anti-majoritarianism, you will have to go to originalism, that is 377 at the time when it was enacted, and living constitutionalism, which will mean 377 today. Likewise, you will do for Santhara. Santhara, at the time when it was being done and constitution had come in, and today, that is living constitutionalism, we have moved on in our understanding of constitution and what it means from 1950 to 2015. So something which could have passed muster as the majoritarian view in 1950 may still continue in the statute book, but there may be serious doubt whether it is today a majoritarian view. So irrespective of my specific answer or yes or no, the point I am making is that the counter-majoritarian principle in terms of identifying and putting in a module what is the majoritarian view is something which is easier said than done. Because what is a majoritarian view may not be so clear as it is, say for instance, if Parliament were to make a law, the Anti-Santhara Taking of Life Act 2015, then at least you know that today this apparently represents the majoritarian view. But absent such a law, and when you examine an old, if I may say so, a custom or an old religious practice with the constitutional lights or constitutional searchlight of today as interpreted over the last 65 years, then what is the majoritarian view may lose that fine, unblurred distinction. You may find that it phases at the end and there is no clear answer. Likewise for Jammu. So my answer to my chair is really this, that it depends on how you examine it. You can surely take a view that 309 represents the majoritarian will. And if 309 represents the majoritarian will, and as understood till today, Santhara practice doesn't run afoul 309 because it's been there and nobody has challenged it. So the majoritarian will lives with the idea that Santhara is not contrary to 309. If that is what you accept, doing reverse engineering like in realism when judges decide cases, if this is what you accept, then your answer is that the Santhara order is really counter-majoritarian because it runs contrary to what has been accepted by the people to be an activity or a religious practice which doesn't run afoul 309. Why? Not because there has been an act saying so, but because of the past practice and the fact that there has been reasonable tolerance of that practice. The counter to that is, of course, there is no tolerance to that practice. Today, as you know about it, there are several things in society which you may not have known earlier, which may not have been on your table earlier. Now they are on your table. And therefore, there is a question of the majoritarian support to such a practice. In which case, if that is it, then the order of the Rajasthan High Court is not counter majority. So the answer is not that first I answer whether it is majoritarian or not. It's the reverse. That is, do you take a stand that Santhara is a part which is an activity permitted by 309, or is it an activity not permitted by 309? And that will determine your answer to the question whether it is a counter majoritarian or non-counter majoritarian activity. So the answer is not important. The process by which you reach to that answer, I think, holds the key. And of course, the answer can be divided. But I think the process is more important here. And the same would apply to the beef bank provision of the RPC.
Somebody asked a question. The legislative majority is always a fiction. Does it really reflect the people's will?
There's a lot, very true. At a first blush level, the answer is of course no. But then there is a lot of scholarly work on this. For instance, they say that if you as a court exercise continuously counter-majoritarian power, as Professor put to me, does it really affect the evolution of rule of law and democracy? They say that, look, in England, the courts have kept away from exercise of counter-majoritarian power. Therefore, when the legislature sits down and makes a law, it says that, look, the chances are that this will remain on the statute book. So let's look at the pros and cons. Whereas in US, when they make the law, and there's a lot of interesting literature on this, they say, look, if there's anything wrong, the Supreme Court will deal with it. Let's push it through. So psychologically also, it has an effect on legislative lawmaking. Then comes your question, that is it actually with it is the flip side. Is the court completely unaccountable? And is Parliament really majoritarian? There are no simple answers to it. There are no simple answers.
But if somebody comes from the same state, the court, and says, abolition of sati is unconstitutional. Right? And argue that abolition of sati is unconstitutional. If you uphold a practice like Santhara, why don't you uphold a practice like sati? How would you argue?
Professor, there are two things here. How would I react and how would I argue? I'll argue depending on how I'm briefed.
I want both.
You see, the question is also a matter of degree. The categorization changes with the question of degree as well. Because a degree can make something which is otherwise just about acceptable sitting on the dividing line between acceptable and constitutionally unacceptable and push it beyond to something being unacceptable. Santhara by and large is a much longer process of giving up your life. So the chances are that the person who indulges in it actually does it willingly. Sati, on the other hand, has a much shorter decision-making period, and the chances of its abuse are therefore larger. I've just lost my husband, I'm completely shattered. My brother-in-laws and all say, yeah, become a sati, you will become a devi. They help me along, push me along, and before I know, I'm in it. Santhara is not like that. Santhara is a long drawn-out process with exit clauses all along the way. Sati doesn't. So maybe that's a distinction. Ultimately, therefore, what I meant was, Professor, that it will depend on the sensitivity which one wants to attach to the question of degree, to the question of how it affects the social fabric, to the question of what you think is right and wrong eventually.
Raj wants to ask a question.
Thank you so much. I missed Parag's presentation, but I have a sense of what he would have presented. I just wanted to ask one question or rather a comment, that courts are not involved in pretty much deciding what the public thinks. I mean, the constitutional duty and responsibility of the courts are to interpret the constitution and see whether, and legislation, and see whether there is a violation in it. So, in some ways, this very question itself is problematic, that should the courts be thinking about what people are thinking, because that's not what the courts are engaged in that process. In some ways, it would probably be violating the constitutional norms if it is engaged in the process of, so there will be occasions when the court will go with the public opinion because it coincided with it. There will be occasions when the court will be completely counter to public opinion. But in both cases, that's not the reason why the court arrived at a particular conclusion. It is continuously and at all times exercising its constitutional duties and responsibilities. So in a way, the question itself to me is odd and awkward when it comes to thinking about what court should be doing.
I think that's a great point, but I have a response to it. Yeah? Quickly. See, yes, the court never says we did it because of public opinion. The function of the court is, you forget public opinion because that is being taken care of by the legislature. You apply the law. And there, Professor Rajkumar is absolutely right. That is the classical purist function of the court. But does it work like that? That's the issue. There you have this whole host of American literature and English literature, but more American, which says actually the American Supreme Court is the most majoritarian institution. It seldom does anti-majoritarian function, seldom. So the court would not, and that's my guess, that's my understanding, would not do something which it feels will go down very badly with the people at large. And that's not its constitutional function. But as I said, since every institution has to have a pocket of legitimacy, a foundational legitimacy, and court's foundational legitimacy is with scholars like all of you who are here and with the people at large. So it will never be unmindful of what its judgment will do to its foundational legitimacy. So, though Professor Rajkumar is absolutely right, this is no part of court's province to see how will my judgments be taken by the people. But it is never far from the court's mind. That is the point I was making. But I think it's a great interjection.
Yes, Neeraj.
So in continuation with that only, I got this feeling that you are reflecting the views of Justice Antonin Scalia in Roberts Court judgment, that if you want to have it, but Constitution has nothing to do with it.
My respect for him goes up. Yes, of course.